of the IEA, Peter Koenen, the presenter, and myself, Erwin Spekele, co-chair. I wish you a warm welcome to this webinar on physical activity at work. What is it? What should we do with it? Just a short notification that we will be recording this session. So if you disagree, raise your hand or leave the session. I would also ask you to type any questions that you have in the Q&A, so in the chat, and we will answer them after the presentation by Peter. If you need a certificate of this webinar, that is possible. We request you then to do the survey at the end of the webinar, and then you will be emailed the webinar. Okay, as I mentioned, the webinar is called Physical Activity at Work. What is it? What should we do with it? The goal of this online webinar is to inform ergonomists on the topic of the physical activity paradox. And the webinar will show why ergonomists should be aware of the emerging evidence about physical loads and what they can do with it. The presenter is sitting next to me in Amsterdam. His name is Peter Koenen. He's a principal investigator of the Amsterdam University Medical Center, Department of Public and Occupational Health. And his research focus is on the health effects of work, on how this impacts on socio-economic health inequalities, and on finding ways for vulnerable workers to live long and healthy working lives. His research findings are therefore nicely captured in a catchphrase that he tends to borrow from the headline of a Dutch newspaper that covered one of his studies, and the headline was "Bricklaying is no workout." I'll give the presentation to Peter. Peter, please go ahead.
Yes, you should unmute, Erwin.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm on.
Yes.
Yeah. I still hear echo.
Not from me.
Did you mute
your
audio?
Yeah.
Okay. Great. All right. No worries. Yeah, thanks a lot, Erwin, for the introduction. I think you summed up nicely what I do. But one thing you didn't mention is that I'm also vice president of Human Factors NL, which is the Dutch Society for Human Factors, which may be interesting to note for you. As you mentioned, Erwin, I'm going to talk about physical activity at work. What is it, and what should we do with it? And it's really nice that I can share my knowledge on this topic with you today. Yes, and as you mentioned, Erwin, I'm using a catchphrase for my topic, which was actually part of which was actually a headline in one of the national newspapers in the Netherlands. You used a slightly different translation for it, but what I'm using here is "Carrying bricks is not fitness," and this is actually already the conclusion of my story today. So I'm actually spilling the beans here today. And now already this is the conclusion, but I hope to tell you a bit more about it in the next hour or so. And yeah, what it has to do with is with this guy. This guy is carrying bricks all day at work, doing this for his entire life, and yeah. As an ergonomist or as a human factors specialist, you probably know that that this may not be the best thing for health to do. And of course, that holds for carrying bricks, what a construction worker does, but it also holds for a lot of other occupations where we see a lot of physical work demands, cleaners, healthcare workers, road workers, and there's more examples, of course. Yeah, what you do as a ergonomist or healthcare human factors specialist is that you might use the traditional ergonomic principles, which is trying at first to eliminate the risk, so eliminate the physical work demands that a worker like the construction worker I showed you on the previous slide has, and if elimination doesn't work, moving down the pyramid by trying to substitute engineer out controls or do any of the other controls according to the ergonomic principles. And for that, you may be, probably also because you're visiting this webinar, so you may be particularly interested in it, you may be particularly looking at musculoskeletal health. So in that sense, my story may not be entirely new to you, but still I hope that after today, you'll know a bit more about health effects of physically demanding work, not just musculoskeletal health, but moving a bit beyond only that, addressing these health effects is quite complex, actually. I hope you get to learn about that. More complex than we traditionally thought it was. But the good news is that you, as ergonomist or as human factor specialist, can play a key role in addressing these health effects. So these are the main topics for today that we're going to talk about. Okay. Then first to the main topic, physical activity. Well, physical activity is actually a magic bullet in the prevention, primary, secondary, and even tertiary prevention of a lot of health outcomes. There's hardly any organ or system in the human body that doesn't benefit from engaging in physical activity. And because of that, healthcare practitioners, but also ergonomists or other practitioners try to advise people to regularly engage in physical activity behavior. And for that, we do have physical activity guidelines. This is one of the guidelines. This is the WHO guideline. And it tells people to engage in at least 150 minutes of physical activity a week. You probably know this guideline already. And it tells us more. It also tells us to engage in muscle strengthening activities. There's some more statements that are in the guidelines. It, for example, also tells us that doing something is better than doing nothing, and every small bit helps. So yeah, to sum up, I think we can conclude that regularly engaging in physical activity is actually quite a good thing, and we try to teach people in society to actually do that. You would, if you assume that, then you would actually think that the guy on the right, who is on his feet all day, who's easily meeting these physical activity guidelines, is much healthier than the guy on the left. But surprisingly, that is not the case. What we're talking about here are socioeconomic health inequalities, and I'm showing you a picture here from the Netherlands, Dutch data, and these data actually show these health inequalities because it shows differences in life expectancy, the red bars, but also differences in years lived in good health between people with high education and people with low education. And low education are obviously typically workers in physically demanding jobs. And what we see here is that the socioeconomic health inequalities actually are quite large. If you look at the red bars, we see that those in lower education with lower education level actually live 7 years shorter. And looking at the blue, we also see that years lived in good health is also 7 years shorter. So to sum up, it adds to 14 years living less in good health in the low education people in low education level compared to high education. So it's actually quite an issue. That's actually quite surprising, of course, because as I mentioned, you would expect people with physically demanding works, if you look at the physical activity guidelines, to live longer and healthier, but that's not the case, as we see in socioeconomic health differences. And what may explain this is the so-called physical activity paradox. And the physical activity paradox is emerging evidence that shows positive health outcomes associated with leisure time physical activity and adverse health outcomes associated with occupational physical activity. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. This is a study from Denmark. It's a study looking at ischemic heart disease mortality. And what it shows is that the more physically active people are at leisure time, quite in line with physical activity guidelines, the lower the risk of, in this case, ischemic heart disease mortality gets. So this is nothing new, all in line with physical activity guidelines and with common knowledge. The opposite, however, is true when looking at physical activity at work, because for physical activity at work, we see that the more physically active people get, the higher the risk of this health outcome gets. What I get a lot is, well, this has to do with lifestyle and with socioeconomic status and with other health outcomes or health behaviors. But it's good to know, you can see it here on the bottom of the slide, that these effects that I show here are actually adjusted for quite some of these factors. So even adjusted for these factors, we see these effects, and actually quite interesting. So this is an example of the physical activity paradox, and here I show it again graphically. The physical activity paradox is the more active people get at leisure time, the lower the risk of various health outcomes. And I just showed you one example, but it actually holds true for a lot of different health outcomes. And the opposite, interestingly, is true for occupational health, because for occupational health, we saw emerging evidence that the more active people get, the higher the risk of various health outcomes. And this is where actually my journey started, because I saw this evidence emerging and I thought I want to know more about this. So this is actually the first study that I did on the topic. It was published in the BJSM in 2018. And in this study, we looked at the health outcomes, in this case, all-cause mortality of physical activity at work. And we did a systematic review and meta-analysis to look at the topic. And this is the main outcome table of that study. What you see here is a forest plot, and it actually shows the effects for males and for females. And what you see here is effects that we saw in all sorts of different articles. And then on the right-hand side, you see the risk of all-cause mortality from in a group of people who are high versus low physically active at work, and effects on the right-hand side of the vertical bar show an increased risk of people in physically demanding jobs, and on the left-hand side is a decreased risks. And what we did is we summed up all those studies. Those are the effects that you see here. And what we saw summing up all that evidence, is an 18% higher risk of mortality for males, but not for females. So this was quite interesting. Yeah, we wanted to know more about it. So what we did in the previous slide was actually a traditional systematic review where we looked at the literature and tried to sum up the literature. What we then thought is we need to do better than that. We need more evidence. We need better evidence. So we actually got in contact with all the authors from all the studies, and we asked them to provide us individual participant data that we can then look a bit closer into the effects with. And here are the results of that study that is actually just submitted to a journal. We had data on 22 different studies from more than 600,000 participants all over the world. And what we showed is, actually quite in line again with guidelines and with common knowledge, that the more people get, the more people become physically active during leisure time, the lower the risk of all-cause mortality gets for male in an unadjusted model, also in an adjusted model, adjusted for those important factors that you may want to consider. We found this effect for males and also for females. And then when looking at occupational physical activity at work, in line with our earlier study and in line with the physical activity paradox, we showed the reverse. So we showed that the more physically active people got at work, the higher the risk of all-cause mortality. Again, in males, in the unadjusted model. In the adjusted model, the effects attenuated a bit, but still remained statistically significant. And again, in line with our earlier findings from the traditional systematic review, we showed null effects for females. And this was probably the moment when that national newspaper in the Netherlands published a paper, an article about our study, and the header of that article was "Tennishow is geen fitness," which is Dutch for "Carrying bricks is not fitness." And I think this actually sums up quite nicely the conclusion of our study so far. And I use it quite often if I talk about this topic, because it, like I said, it sums quite nicely the conclusion. But I have to acknowledge the Trouw National Journal for that. And not only the national press in the Netherlands heard about our research, but also the World Health Organization heard about our research. Because I was just showing you the physical activity guidelines by the World Health Organization. They actually renew these guidelines every 10 years or so, and when they do that, they actually try and see if there's emerging evidence in the literature, and if there's emerging evidence, then they ask specific experts groups to come up with reports about that emerging evidence. And that's what they did with us. They actually asked us, our research group, to come up with an umbrella review searching for evidence on occupational physical activity and all potential health outcomes. So until that moment, we had already only looked at mortality as health outcomes, but the WHO Physical Activity Guideline Committee actually asked us to come up with a review on all potential health outcomes. And we summarized that evidence. We also graded the evidence. So we graded it for the quality of the evidence. And the results of that you can see here. This is again a forest plot like the one I showed you before, but instead of each line being a different study, in this figure, each line is actually a different health outcome. Within the second column, you actually see the number of studies underlying that. And yeah, what we saw here, again, on the right-hand side, you can see the effects. What we saw here is that there are some studies or some health outcomes for which more physical activity at work was actually health beneficial. We saw some cancers for which that was the case, for example. We saw some health outcomes for which we found null effects. Here are some, and here's one more. And we saw some health outcomes in line with our previous work, showing that that the more physical activity people are at work, the higher the risk of those health outcomes, all-cause mortality, osteoarthritis, and sleep quality, and the higher the risk of those health outcomes get. So what we concluded from that article is that there is some evidence for a physical activity paradox, but we had to be fair. What we also concluded is that effect sizes were imprecise and from moderate quality evidence at best. We summed up the literature and we found that the evidence was actually not too good, moderate quality at best. And that had to do with the fact that all evidence was from occupational physical activity self-reports, with various definitions that were quite heterogeneous, actually. And there was also a risk of bias from disturbing factors, which is called residual confounding. And try to explain that a bit better. That was actually also discussed in this editorial that was also written as a response to our earlier work. And what these authors actually concluded is that, yeah, these two guys, the one on the left-hand side who is not so much physically active at work, and the one on the right-hand side who is very physically active at work, they not just differ from one another in terms of their physical work demands, but they also differ in terms of their lifestyle behavior, sleeping pattern, stress, their financial situation, and also other work hazards that they may have. And like I showed you before, in most of the evidence that we see, statistical adjustments have been made for these factors, and effects remain even after adjustment for these factors. But that's not always the case in all the evidence. And that is a concern, of course, for the quality of the evidence, and that's one of the things that we concluded in that report. So, can we still conclude that carrying bricks is not fitness? Well, we were a bit more skeptical, I have to say. So instead of this, we now are more inclined to go with this, that well, physical activity at work is at least not health beneficial, and it may or may not harm people's health. Also, the WHO Physical Activity Guideline Committee, they read our report, of course, and they concluded, I underlined it here in red, less evidence on associations by different domains of physical activity, and therefore it was difficult to differentiate the effects of different domains of physical activity on various health outcomes. And by domains, they mean work and leisure, of course. So what they eventually ended up recommending is what you see here on the bottom, is that, yeah, we should all engage in physical activity. And for adults, physical activity can be undertaken as part of recreational and leisure, transportation, work, or household chores. So, yeah, what they actually concluded is it doesn't matter how you do your physical activity as long as you do physical activity. Okay, but all that aside, all those methodological limitations aside, it is actually quite imaginable that there are physiological differences between physical activity at work and during leisure time, because you can probably imagine that the two activities, the two domains of physical activity are quite different actually. If you work in a physically demanding job, it is often quite repetitive work, has quite a lot of lifting, awkward postures, these kind of physical work demands. Whereas if you engage in physical activity during leisure time, you can imagine you go for a run, it's quite high intensity, or you go play soccer or tennis. You use your entire body, and the activity is very different. And not just in its intensity, but also in its duration and recovery. Because work you typically do for 8 hours a day, multiple days a week, multiple weeks a year, multiple years in a lifetime, without much recovery. Whereas leisure time, again, if you go for that run, or if you go and play ball, you do that for a short amount of time, and you get to recover afterwards. Which may be fitness enhancing, whereas work, doing that for long periods of time, may actually not be hands enhancing, but may actually strain your system, your musculoskeletal system, but also your cardiovascular system. It may not be health enhancing. So this we all wrote in a book chapter. I reference here on the bottom of the slide, so you can look back at it if you want to know more at it. These were the hypotheses that we had for why physical activity at work and during leisure time may have differential physiological health effects. And we didn't just hypothesize it, but we also actually found evidence for it. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples of that evidence. First evidence was from a Danish study. The Danes are actually doing quite a lot of work on this topic. And in this study, Danish cleaners were measured. Measurements of cardiorespiratory fitness were conducted, physical activity was measured, and heart rate was measured. And what the researchers showed is that these cleaners actually took a lot of steps a day, 20,000 a day. Well, I'm happy if I can take 10,000 steps a day. That would be a good day for me. But the Danish cleaners actually took 20,000 steps every day. But despite that they were so active, they actually had quite a low fitness. And this may have to do with this figure. This is a figure showing the heart rate reserve that these cleaners were active in. And what you see here is that the cleaners actually spent quite a lot of time in relatively low intensity physical activity. So what one can call the fatiguing zone, and they don't spend much time in relatively high intensity physical activity, which would actually enhance health, fitness and health. So they may not spend their activities at work in the best way, so to say. Another study is a Belgian study showing that the more physical activity people get at work, the more strained the cardiometabolic system gets in terms of blood pressure, which is shown on the vertical axis. And the third example is showing the same thing. So the more physical activity people get at work, the more strained the system gets in this case in terms of atherosclerosis, which is plaque that we see in the arteries of these people. So all in all, yeah, there we have some evidence showing that physical activity may not be health enhancing. There may be some limitations with that evidence, but all in all, I think we can conclude that physical activity at work does not show the same health benefits as physical activity during leisure time. And what does that actually mean? Yeah, that means that this guy who's carrying bricks all day, but also other workers in physically demanding jobs. I already showed you the cleaners, the healthcare workers, the road workers. They are exposed to high physical activity at work, which may not be health enhancing, may or may not be health enhancing. And yeah, because they are so active at work, they do not engage so much in less time physical activity, which may also not be health enhancing. So they're actually in double trouble. They don't get the benefit from less time physical activity, and they may be exposed to the potential health hazards of occupational physical activity at work. Occupational, yeah. Yeah, and yeah, what should we do then about it? Yeah, I think it would be good to get a for these people to get a better balance between their leisure time and occupational physical activity, because it's it's sort of a vicious circle. People are physically active at work, and because they are not so much active during leisure time, which is not benefiting their fitness, which then again makes them less active during leisure time. And yeah, it's sort of a vicious circle. And what we need to do, I think, is get a better balance for these people, trying to interrupt this vicious circle. And a way in which we can do that is trying to find the sweet spot physical activity behavior for these people. And there's actually quite a nice paper from 2021, again by a group of Danes. I already mentioned the Danes are quite active in this topic, and what they showed is that we should, that everybody should actually strive for a good balance between being active, being sedentary. Active you see here on the left. Oh, where's my arrow? Active you see here, being sedentary is here, sleeping is there, and we should actually try and find a right balance, which is in the green spot between these different physical activity behaviors. But that balance, that sweet spot, may be different depending on what sort of physical activity you do at work. So for a white-collar worker, the sweet spot may be here, but for the manufacturer, the manufacturing worker, the sweet spot may be a bit more towards being sedentary, and for cleaners, it may be even more towards sedentary. So yeah, trying to find that sweet spot of a good balance between physical activity at work and leisure time, and being active and being sedentary. That is, I think, what we should strive for. But that sweet spot may be different for each and every person, and that's the challenge I think that we have. Yeah, and another question is, if people are physically demanding, if people are physically active at work, do they actually still benefit from engaging from physical activity during leisure time? Because the physical activity guidelines actually suggest that someone who is physically active at work may not need much physical activity during leisure time anymore, because he or she is already easily meeting guidelines during work. Well, we looked at this topic in a study that was recently published. We looked at the amount of benefit that people have from engaging in different levels of physical activity during leisure time, and we showed that among people in sedentary jobs, people, as you would expect, benefit from engaging in leisure time physical activity. The risk of health effects is reduced the more active people get during their leisure time. And surprisingly, well, at least to our surprise, these effects were quite comparable in other occupational sectors as well. So actually, in every sector or in every mode of occupational physical activity, we saw that people actually benefit from engaging in leisure time physical activity, which is to some extent a good thing, I would say. The question then is, how do we get people in physically active jobs to be active at leisure time again? Well, this is another study that we did in which we looked at interventions for leisure time physical activity. So trying to make people more active during leisure time. And we saw, you can see it in this picture here, that they were actually quite effective for people in sitting jobs. But then we can compare those interventions to for participants in physically demanding jobs, and we actually saw that that those interventions were actually a lot less effective. We actually, out of all these interventions, we saw that none of them was actually effective among workers in physically demanding jobs. So yes, we know that people in physically demanding jobs may benefit from engaging in leisure time physical activity, but we don't actually quite know how to get them physically active during leisure time. And there may be good reasons for that. We did another study where we actually asked workers in physically demanding jobs how their day looks like, so what they do during a typical work day in terms of their activities at work and during leisure time, and what influences their physical activity behavior. And what we saw is that there are actually quite a lot of barriers and facilitators for people to be or not be physically active in their leisure time if they are already physically active at work. We did a qualitative study in which we asked the same question to a lot of physically demanding workers. And then we got some interesting quotes, actually, some of which I'm going to show you now. There was one guy who said, you're physically active, but not so much that you are physically busy, but not so physically that you don't really exercise. You have a tough job, so you have to exercise. Besides, it's also important mentally to do something on the side. So this guy actually acknowledged the potential benefits of engaging in physical activity. But this other guy actually, mentions why, although the effects are quite acknowledged, he may not do that, because he mentioned, I don't do sports now. I'm glad I can sit down for a while in the evening. We've been exercising all day. One of the boys had a pedometer which counted 35,000 steps that day. That's more than 14 kilometers, and half of it with a full wheelbarrow. Yeah, so you can imagine that if your workday looks like that you don't want to go for a run or don't want to play tennis or other sports at night. That's quite imaginable, actually, that it's an important barrier for you to be physically active during leisure time. And we also asked these people, yeah, what is then a barrier for them or a facilitator to do something about their physically demand at work, because of course, yeah, you can imagine that if you're physically demanding, if you're in a physically demanding job and that's preventing you from being physically active during leisure time, yeah, then another thing that you can do is do something about your physical demand at work. But we saw some very important barriers for that as well. This hairdresser mentioned, hey, even though I'm just well insured, my clients are getting a bit impatient now. I have regular customers and they've been with another hairdresser since January. So yeah, this person was just worried that he or she would lose customers if they would be doing less physical activity at work, be less active at work. And this guy mentioned, if I would work for a boss, I would be on sick leave, but now I'm the boss myself. That's why I'm going on despite the pain. And the last guy said, I'm not working on light work. I'm now working on light work because otherwise I won't last. I'm now working on wallpaper at a painting company. So this guy actually found a way to, yeah, to be less active at work, to work in less demanding, to do less demanding tasks, and that actually helped him in his work and probably also in the rest of his life. Okay, well, quite an interesting story. But you may imagine what can I, as an ergonomist or a human factor specialist, actually do with this? Well, I think what you can learn from my story is that human nature is complex. Yeah, like I showed you in that one figure with the looking for the sweet spot of physical activity behavior, is that sweet spot may be different for everybody. So what we have to do to get people more healthy is to find a better balance between being physically active at work and being physically active in leisure time. But finding that right balance may actually be quite complex, because it may be different for everybody. Yeah, and I'm hoping that after today you embrace that complexity a bit. I also hope that you go beyond traditional economic principles of just trying to lower the workload. Lowering it may not be the best thing for everybody because of that complexity. And you may also go beyond musculoskeletal health only, because yeah, there's of course more health outcomes that matter a lot as well. And yeah, like I already mentioned, the most important goal should be to find the right balance, sweet spot between work and leisure time. I think you, as an ergonomist or a human factor specialist, actually have the knowledge and skills to do this. So yeah, I challenge you to do this, but I'm quite confident that you can do this. Last slide for you to remember is that despite the limitations, the positive health effects of leisure time physical activity are sometimes, but not always, present for occupational physical activity. So we can, I think, quite confidently conclude that carrying bricks is not fitness, and that there's an important message for large groups in our society who engage in physically demanding work, who are maybe because of that limited in their leisure time physical activities. And for those people, we should design a more balanced physical activity behavior, balancing leisure time and work, and finding that sweet spot for these people. Yeah, so I hope you learned a bit from this. Thank you a lot for your attention. Please reach out after today if you want to know more, but I'm happy to take questions now as well.
Yeah, first of all, Peter, thank you very much Yeah, did you mute yours?
Yeah.
For a very interesting presentation. As you mentioned, we are now open for the Q&A. And Steve, if you would like to do that, because then we don't need to.
Yeah, no problem, Erwin. Again, Dr. Koonin, thank you. This is a wonderful presentation. For folks that have been following along online, please use the Q&A, and if you want to enter your questions in the chat, and then I can help Dr. Koonin moderate some of these. Peter, one of the first questions that popped up, and I think it popped up before you got to this slide, so you may have already covered it a little bit, but can you speak to how much lifestyle, diet, and substance account for some of the differences you see when you're looking at health outcomes between different physical labor groups? So this kind of socioeconomic status piece.
Yeah, so you're probably referring to one of the earlier slides that I showed. Let's see if I can go there quickly. Yeah, it's not this one. It's probably sorry.
It was probably about a third of the way in or so.
Yeah, I
The
know.
question popped up just before this slide, so you may have already addressed it, but we can circle back.
This one. Yeah, so what we see here is the increased risk that we see from being physically active during work, and it's actually quite high when not adjusting for any factors. So you see here a 1.35, something like that, which is a 35 increased risk of all-cause mortality in that unadjusted model. And it gets a bit attenuated when adjusting for leisure time physical activity, BMI, age, and smoking, and even more so when adjusting for socioeconomic status as well. And here the effect is what is it, 1.15 or something like that. So the effects gets attenuated by half of its size or something like that. So yeah, I would say quite a fair chunk of the effect is by lifestyle factors and substance factors, but still quite a large chunk as well for physical activity at work.
And now that we're on this slide, there's another question related to gender differences, and Nancy from Moncton, New Brunswick, Canada, is just asking about maybe thoughts on differences between men and women in terms of risks.
Yeah, I should have mentioned that. I forgot that. It's I think, well, the honest question is that we don't quite know yet why for males we see stronger effects than for females, where we typically see null effects. But our hypothesis is that it has to do with that that a lot of physically demanding jobs are typically male dominated. If you look at the construction or the road workers, those are sectors that are male dominated. Of course, there's also physically demanding jobs where we see quite some females, healthcare work, for example. But I think generally speaking, most of the physically demanding jobs are male dominated, and that's why we see stronger effects for males than females. That's our hypothesis, but we need more evidence to get to know more about it.
Yeah, great. So questions from Nathan Birch and Caitlin Gallagher. I'm going to pair them together here a little bit. But Peter, could you talk a little bit about specific tools or methods that can help HFE professionals make suggestions around work design to find that sweet spot? And then the corollary of that, or the secondary point of that, is how have businesses reacted to the message that, you know, maybe we need to make these job changes to find that sweet spot around physical activity?
Yeah, so your first question, you mean in terms of technologies or
Yeah, from an implementation and process perspective. So for the HFE folks in the call, what specific things could they do to help find that sweet spot?
Yeah. Well, I think it starts with being aware of the system that a worker is living in. So a worker obviously is not just what he or she does at work, but also has a private life in which he or she does certain things, physical activity, behavior, but also other lifestyle things. There may be financial issues in leisure time that matter to these people that impact their behaviors, or there's a whole range of things that could matter to these people, and I think it starts with being aware of that, and trying to get to know the worker a bit better in that sense, and then together with the worker, trying to find that sweet spot, knowing the system around it. I know it sounds a bit fake the way I described it right now, but I think it basically boils down to that. And then your second question was about how companies respond to it, right?
Yeah, and I'll actually, if I can extend that a little bit, so just in your response there, I think what's interesting and what I love about these webinars is that it's a group of international folks around the table where each country approaches legislation, work, privacy a little bit differently. So maybe from the Netherlands perspective, you spoke a little bit about, understanding individuals' constraints, maybe financially or things that are happening outside of the workplace. But finding that type of information may be very difficult in some countries versus others. So I'm tangenting a little bit here, but from a business perspective, what does this look like? What's the responsibility of a business or an employer to engage and support health beyond the workplace? If I could challenge you there.
You're totally right. There's firstly there's privacy issues. So in at least in the Netherlands, but probably also in other countries, a worker doesn't have to disclose things about his or her private life or health status or things like that to his employer, but also not to his to a ergonomist, for example. So there's issues around that indeed. If a worker doesn't want to talk about it, then then that may prevent you from addressing it, of course. And also that the employer also of course knows that, and sometimes doesn't want to mingle with what people do in their private lives, and rightly so, I think, because I think that the responsibility of the employer is mainly to make to put workers not at risk during their work. I think that's the main responsibility of the employer. So I think the story may vary or may be different for the employer than for the ergonomist in that sense, because the ergonomists can of course try to address both work and private, but I think it's quite right that the main focus of the employer is to make the work as best as possible and not put workers at risk.
Yeah, I think that really reinforces your concluding point about the complexity of addressing all of these issues. So just changing gears a little bit, really interesting question by Garrett around thinking of work design from the lens of fitness. And I'm paraphrasing the question here a little bit, but in fitness, you might think of frequency, intensity, time type as a way to prescribe exercise. But when we think about it from an ergo lens, we're thinking, force, repetition, duration, posture.
Yeah.
Should there be a push to try to mesh these a little bit more and thinking about work, maybe from the perspective of like a frequency, intensity, time type approach?
Yeah. Yeah, I think, maybe what Garrett means is that can we tweak those modalities, so intensity, frequency, duration, in such a way that it may actually not be detrimental for health, but health enhancing? That may be what Garrett means, and I think that's true. I think we again, the Danish group that I showed some studies about, they are piloting now some intervention studies in which they actually try to do that. So trying to make the work in terms of intensity or duration, frequency, a bit more health enhancing. So probably trying to make the activities more intense, but of shorter duration or shorter frequency. Trying to do that, and I think they're still piloting that, so we have to wait for the results of those kind of studies to come. But I can imagine that may also be a way forward.
Just a couple more questions, and I know we're getting close to time. So a question around self-report versus objective measures. So what suggestions might you have for cost-effective ways to get a better objective approximation of physical activity at work or in leisure?
Cost effective, you say. So I think it doesn't have to cost a lot. We're all carrying around smartphones, and they have a lot of ways to measure steps, but also other kinds of other modalities of physical activities, but also the wearables, the pedometers or the heart rate monitors and stuff. They're also not that expensive anymore at the moment. I think there's new technology offers quite some possibilities there.
Excellent. Well, I see we're just at time here. We've taken an hour of your time, Peter. I know there's a couple questions left. Peter, if I could just get you briefly to put your last slide up again with your email address. And for folks that have additional questions or would like to learn more, I'm sure Peter would welcome a conversation. So please feel free to email. But on behalf of the IEA and the MSD Technical Committee, Erwin and I very much appreciative of your time today, Peter, and thank you for a wonderful presentation. So
yeah, you're welcome.
for those, again, just